Hi, we're going to get started now. It's my pleasure to introduce Khalidi from New York University, who's going to be speaking about cross-cutting psychoneural kinds and episodic memory.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Catherine, and thanks very much to the organizers. It's really a pleasure and privilege to be here. And I want especially to thank Jackie Sullivan for thinking of inviting me to this conference. I'm a philosopher, for those of you who don't know, and I'm going to be talking in very broad terms about the various taxonomic options that we may be faced with in thinking about a structure to function mapping, a psychoneural mapping or psychological mapping. And so the first half of my talk, I'm going to paint with a very broad brush some of the main options as I see them in terms of structure to function mapping. And then for the second half of the talk, I'm going to narrow it down a little bit and talk about episodic memory. And there, I fear that I'm going to be a little out of my depth because I'm sure a lot of people here know much more about episodic memory. So these are, think of them as just sort of suggestive and exploratory ideas about how episodic memory might complicate matters for a very neat structure to function mapping that of the kind that we're often seeking when looking at sort of how the mind maps onto the brain. So just to start, if it'll let me start. So here's a kind of taxonomy of taxonomic positions. You might say that when it comes to structure to function mapping, there are various options. Now, I'm going to try and map out some. I don't know if this is an exhaustive list. And certainly, some of these options are not entirely mutually exclusive, as I'll go on to try and explain. So first, you have what might be called localism, which presupposes something like a very neat one-to-one structure to function mapping. And I'll say more about each of these in due course. Another position, perhaps a diametrically opposed position, is what you might call wholism. Here, wholism with a W. It's not quite the same thing, I think, that philosophers sometimes mean when they say wholism with an H. Here, more or less, the idea is that the whole brain really, or large swaths or large regions are implicated in more or less all cognitive tasks, and that maybe what differentiates them is not so much any kind of regional specialization, but something like levels of activation or something like that. So it's a kind of diametrically opposed view. A third option is what has been called revisionism, which is roughly the idea that, yes, there might be something like a one-to-one mapping, but it won't involve the cognitive ontology that we currently have. It won't involve our current psychological taxonomic categories. We're going to have to revise them and come up with new ones in order to be able to effect that kind of mapping. But the view I want to focus on more is what I will call contextualism. And contextualism, I think, can be divided up into several different or several sort of sub-views, one of which you might call neural contextualism. And here I think it's a view that more or less agrees with quite a few other people or other researchers, both neuroscientists, psychologists, and philosophers, have talked about, which has something to do with the fact that the neural context somehow specifies what any region is going to do. So whatever other regions are active with it is really what's going to determine the function of any given region. So the function of any given region can't really be specified independently of the other regions that it might be coactive with. But a different kind of contextualism that I'm going to mention briefly is what you might call developmental contextualism. So here the idea is to look more at the sort of broader developmental context in which the organism is situated to understand exactly what function that the brain is performing at a particular time. And depending on the developmental context, what might look at the neural level as more or less the same function turns out at the broader sort of developmental in the broader developmental context to be performing quite different kind of function. And then finally, the thing that I want to focus on most, and I think here's where I think episodic memory can give us a little bit of insight, is something more like the broader environmental and etiological context, by which I mean the sort of causal history of a particular state. So even though the states might look the same at the neural level, if one is studying the organism in a context and the organism with a particular causal history, then what might appear at the neural level to be more or less the same function turns out perhaps to be somewhat different. So let me talk about each of these different positions in turn and make some sort of distinctions that that maybe only a philosopher would be interested in, but I hope they might resonate with some people. So as I said, localism can be thought of as the idea that there's a kind of one-to-one mapping between each brain region, call it R1, and each psychological function C. Now, one thing that might, the question that arises and has come up in various talks is, well, does it have to be a single region? Can it be a network of regions? And I think the answer, if you're a localist, has to be, well, surely it can, but provided it doesn't turn out that some subregion R1 is also implicated in a very different kind of function in conjunction with some other set of regions, let's say R4 and R5. Because I think that once you start saying that R1 can somehow play a different role in the context of different networks, then I think it's really hard to maintain that you're a localist anymore. Now, what if R1 is active, either singly or jointly, in some other cognitive capacity or psychological function C star? And here I think localists, to be consistent, will have to say, well, we're not parsing things finely enough. We have to look more closely. And this is a strategy that I've encountered, or this is a response that I've encountered in talking to some neuroscientists who are localists. And in fact, this strategy on behalf of localists has been spelled out in a recent paper by Joseph McCaffrey. I think he calls it the subdivide and conquer response, which is something like, no, look, if you think that R1 is implicated in something very different, well, it's some different little subregion within R1. And as I said, I mean, I remember a recent conversation I had with very talented neuroscientist Rebecca Sachs at MIT, who studies theory of mind. And she's, I think, a diehard localist, self-confessed localist, who says, look, theory of mind is performed mainly by the right temporal parietal junction. That's the region of the brain that does theory of mind. And if you point to certain studies that say, for instance, that theory of mind, or that the right temporal parietal junction is implicated in other tasks, let's say subitizing, or I think there are studies that have shown that it might be recruited when something unexpected comes into the visual field, her response is to say it must be a different subregion within the right TPJ. It can't be the very same part of the right TPJ that's doing theory of mind. And I think that's very consistent of the localist, and I think that's the kind of localism that is pretty prevalent, I think, among many psychologists and neuroscientists, and it's certainly sort of seeped into the popular culture, and this is what we expect when we look at reports in the media about what neuroscience is up to. There's come to be a sort of expectation that we're going to find a fairly neat one-to-one mapping, for better or for worse, as evidenced by this New Yorker cartoon. I don't know if he's saying, see this area right here, that's where we'd like to open a Starbucks, right? A real localist. Again, the idea of neural real estate, I think, has become pretty common in popular treatments. So what about holism? This is maybe not such a prevalent view anymore. I think historically it's been an influential view in the history of neuroscience. But the idea is, well, there isn't really any regional specialization. The whole brain performs each psychological process in concert, or maybe large swaths of the brain, very large networks that operate across the cortex or something like that. So if there are neural correlates, they have to be things like levels of activation, not brain regions or networks. It's not a matter of real estate as much as the way in which these regions are activated or something like that that differentiates one psychological function from another. It's not very easy to find extreme versions of this view in the literature today, but you can maybe think of the notorious Crick and Koch theory of consciousness, which thinks of consciousness as a kind of global unity that's imposed on neurons in many different parts of the brain by oscillations in the 40 to 70 hertz range. This may also be perhaps in one version or another, dynamical systems theory as applied to neuroscience might also be committed to something like a kind of holism view. But as I say, I don't think it's very prevalent. Correct me if I'm wrong, but my impression is it's not as prevalent as it once was, at least in the history of neuroscience. Now, revisionism, I think, has come into play much more recently, and some of the main proponents of this view, I think, are right here at this conference. And the idea here is that the neural regions or networks or processes may not correspond to our current psychological and cognitive constructs, but if we revise them in order to bring them up to, in order to align them with neural constructs, we will find something like a one-to-one mapping. We will be able to restore the one-to-one mapping if we revise our psychological and cognitive constructs. So as I said, of course, Michael Anderson has proposed a view, I think, like this. Russell Poldrack has as well as Price and Friston. And that's a view, I think, that's gaining a lot of currency, and it's a very interesting view. But the view I want to focus on a little bit here is what I'm calling contextualism. As I mentioned briefly here, the basic idea is that some region R1 might subserve a cognitive capacity C in conjunction with R2, but it might very well subserve a very different kind of psychological or cognitive capacity in conjunction with some other region, R3. And here I want to distinguish sort of two variants of this. One variant would say that R1 still has a kind of distinguishable psychological role that could be viewed as the kind of common denominator in C and C star, though it might not be obvious, and we may need to be a bit creative about understanding what exactly that common denominator is. But this seems to take us back to localism, and this might be in some, I mentioned Price and Friston's work. At least in some instances, they seem to be suggesting that that's what's going on, because they say, well, look, the common denominator in some of these seemingly very diverse kind of psychological tasks might be something like sensory motor integration. Not an obvious kind of cognitive or psychological construct, but if you dig deep, you can sort of find the common denominator. A more interesting idea, I think, is the idea that R1 may not have a distinguishable or separable role. Somehow it merges with R2 to produce one thing, and it merges with R3 to produce something completely different. Now, I think that view on the face of it might seem a little counterintuitive, but I think it's a view that's been defended by various people on various grounds. There's a paper by Colin Klein where he suggests something like this. There is no kind of discriminable role. And he has an analogy with the function of a piston in an engine, where the function of the piston in an engine is very different depending what other parts of the engine are doing. You can't say that there's a one thing, at least not non-trivially. There's no non-trivial way of characterizing what the piston does, irrespective of what other parts of the engine are doing. Another analogy here might be sort of basic elemental chemistry. You combine sodium with chlorine, you come up with one compound, you combine it with oxygen and hydrogen to produce sodium hydroxide, you come up with a different compound, and you can't say, it'd be interesting to go back to the history of chemistry and see whether people had this expectation that you could sort of isolate the contribution that sodium made in a very sort of distinct way that corresponded to the sort of broad phenomenological properties of the compound. And I think we now know that there isn't really a clear way of doing that in most instances. You can't say, oh, that's what the sodium does here. It sort of melds with the chlorine to do one thing, and it melds with the oxygen and hydrogen to do something else. So I think that's an interesting view. But the kind of contextualism that I want to concentrate on is something somewhat different, which has more to do with a sort of broader environmental context. In one case that I wanted to mention, and this is something I've done some work on before, but I'm not going to go into it in any detail here, and that has to do with the developmental context. So I looked for a little while at the psychological construct of a critical period. And a critical period, the way that developmental psychologists and others talk about it, is a period during which the organism is particularly sensitive to stimuli of a certain kind. And beyond that critical period, once the critical period ends, and it's differently defined in different organisms for different capacities, then it becomes very difficult for the organism to learn or to acquire a certain capacity. So you could talk about a critical period for song learning in certain species of bird. You can talk about a critical period for language in humans, critical period for certain kinds of perceptual binocular vision in certain species of mammals, and so on. Now, the underlying mechanisms that have been detected for ensuring that that critical period is closed tend to correspond to or tend to ensure that there's a kind of decline in neural capacity, in neural plasticity, which then ensures that that capacity can no longer be acquired after the critical period has closed. So these neural mechanisms, though, it's crucial that they kick in at an early ontogenetic stage in the organism's life. So that same kind of decline in neural plasticity, if it were to occur towards the end of an organism's life, I would suggest would not be considered the closure of a critical period. It would be considered something maybe like the onset of dementia. Now, what creates the difference at the neural level, there's a sense in which those two processes are precisely the same. But if you factor in the broader ontogenetic context, it turns out that psychologically the function that they're performing is very different depending on what developmental phase the organism is in. So that would be one instance of what you might consider to be the developmental context determining what precise function some particular neural mechanism has, what precise psychological or cognitive function it has. Similarly, there are going to be certain instances in which the broader environmental context, or indeed the causal history of the organism, I would argue, determines what psychological function a neural mechanism has, even though at the neural level, when conceived of intrinsically, it may be more or less the same mechanism. So the unit of analysis in these cases would not just be would be the neural construct in context, wouldn't just be the neural mechanism as such, even though I think it would be very legitimate for neuroscientists to say, look, what we're interested in is the intrinsic properties of the mechanism. We're not interested in situating it in context, or at least that goes beyond our specific remit as neuroscientists who are interested in the way these things interact at the cellular or molecular level. Okay. So I want to try and bolster that, or try and give an example of how that would pan out in the case of episodic memory. But just before doing so, I just want to recap the four positions that I've sketched out. So we've got localism on the one hand, holism on the other, revisionism as a third option, and then what I would call contextualism. And the idea here is that either a particular neural region which is in the sort of inclusion of these two kind of this kind of set theoretic almost, or Venn diagrammatic depiction, I suppose. So the neural region, either because it's conjoined or somehow coupled with some other neural region, or when situated in a particular environment or broader context, might perform a very different function. And that, I want to now just kind of allude to the fact, or to back up that hunch a little bit. I wanted to just mention the idea that this kind of mismatch between structure and function is something that is attested in other branches of science. So if we think of sort of gross phenotypic traits, gross anatomical traits, and we think of them in terms of both their structure and their function, I think we can find instances where certain sciences, certain disciplines or subdisciplines may want to categorize things in one way, whereas another discipline or subdiscipline may want to categorize them a different way, and those two categorizations may be cross-cutting. They might be sort of at cross purposes. So think of the forelimb of a cat here. Structurally, it's homologous to the forelimb of a whale, and also structurally homologous to the forelimb of a bat. And we might categorize them all on the basis of a kind of structure-based taxonomy as forelimbs, as homologous forelimbs. But now, if you think of that structure in the bat as being not just a forelimb, but as a wing that has a certain function, if we think of it functionally as opposed to structurally, we might classify it with the wing of a bird, and even perhaps the wing of an insect. And now what we're identifying is kind of functional analogs as opposed to structural homologs. And so what we end up with is a kind of cross-cutting taxonomy. And broadly speaking, I mean, there are disanalogies here, and I don't want to take it too far. I don't want to take this analogy too far. But broadly speaking, function is individuated relative to a broader context, relative to what the organism, what action the organism performs with that structure, not just the sort of internal structural properties of the thing itself. Okay. So in a similar, so we get these cross-cutting taxonomies here. Now, in a roughly analogous or similar way, I want to try and say that the psychological construct of episodic memory introduces certain kinds of considerations which show that what might be individuated with respect to context or with respect to a broader sort of etiological story might not coincide very neatly with the kind of structural individuation that a neuroscientist might be interested in. So episodic memory, very briefly, is very often sort of defined as the capacity to recall personal experiences or past events in one's own life. And I would say it's a kind of prime candidate for extrinsic individuation for various reasons. And I want to try and bring up three broad considerations for why episodic memory has this kind of feature or lends itself to this kind of extrinsic individuation. And why, therefore, kind of taxonomy or certain ways of individuating whether something is an episodic memory or what it is an episodic memory of might not correspond very neatly to the underlying neural story. So there are three features of episodic memory that I want to talk about. One is more philosophical, but I do think it has implications for psychology, and that is the idea that episodic memory is causally individuated with respect to distal causes. The other is this mechanism of pattern separation and pattern completion that is studied by some researchers who talk about episodic memory. At least it's one sort of research program within that broad domain. The third is recent work. Roughly speaking, I mean, this work is diverse and comes from various different parts of psychology and neuroscience, indeed, which can be lumped under the sort of broad umbrella of constructivism, and that means different things to different people, but also this mechanism that's sometimes called reconsolidation, and also considerations about how misremembering occurs. And these three considerations aren't entirely independent, but I think they emphasize different aspects of the phenomena that I think are worth considering separately. So now, philosophers for a long time many philosophers who've theorized about memory have proposed something like a causal theory of memory. So whether something is a memory, what it is a memory of, depends largely on its distal causal history. And those kinds of naive versions, I think, have been revised in light of recent empirical work. But I think many sophisticated recent accounts of how to construe episodic memory, or how to individuate memories and determine whether something is a memory or not, and what it is a memory of, I think continue to incorporate that causal condition. So recent work by Michaelian, I'm not going to say the whole theory, the way that he sort of spells out what are supposed to be necessary and sufficient conditions on remembering, but he has this idea that S remembers P if and only if, and then the third condition I think is particularly important here. There is a causal chain running back from S's current representation of P to an earlier representation of hers. Okay, so there has to be some kind of causal connection for something to be considered a memory. Now, as I mentioned, this taxonomizes memory on the basis of distal causes, not in intrinsic mechanistic properties. And you might say, well, but that's a philosophical theory of memory, right? Why should psychologists be interested in a theory of memory that's really largely a philosopher's creation? Why should they be bound by this kind of condition on what a memory is, and why not revoke that condition in light of certain kinds of psychological findings? Well, it seems to me that causal connection to a previous event or experience is something that a lot of psychologists, at least, are going to be interested in. Because if you're interested in the difference between, say, memory and confabulation, you're going to have to make that distinction, at least in part, on the basis of whether you can trace it back to a previous experience in an individual's life. And so I think many cognitive psychologists, many psychiatrists, and so on, are interested in preserving that distinction. And insofar as they are, they're going to have to at least partly individuate memories based on distal causes. So that's the first kind of broad consideration. A second comes from, as I said, this kind of more recent research on pattern separation and pattern completion, which I've become familiar with thanks to sitting in on lab meetings at Shana Rosenbaum's lab at York, who do a lot of work on this kind of thing. Now pattern separation is, roughly speaking, a kind of encoding process. So if you think of the stages of memory as involving encoding, storage, and retrieval, pattern separation is posited to occur at the encoding stage, whereby similar patterns, when you have experiences that are similar to previous experiences, the idea basically is that they're made more distinct by storing them in a non-overlapping fashion. So the area of overlap between your current experience and previous experiences you might have stored is somehow not preserved in order to further distinguish, in order to in order to allow for the least amount of interference between current experiences that you may want to remember and previous experiences. So it's a means of reducing interference among memories. Pattern completion is kind of the flip side of that. So at the retrieval stage, the idea is you then complete that pattern, and those separated patterns are completed at the retrieval stage in order to yield the full memory representation. So now, as I understand it, there's still a bit of a debate about where the rest comes from. All right? So some people think that the pattern is completed from information that comes from semantic memory. Other people think that the cue itself, the perceptual experience itself, provides the rest of the representation. In either case, I want to claim that this creates a bit of a problem for anyone who is expecting some kind of very neat matchup between the stored representation and the memory as a whole, what functions, at least, for the individual as a memory. What maybe is experienced phenomenologically as the memory, but also what behaviorally and functionally can be considered part of the entire memory. So what are the implications for taxonomy? Here's a very kind of schematic and suggestive proposal for why this creates a bit of a problem, for why pattern separation and pattern completion might create a problem for a very neat psychoneural matchup. So consider a kind of simplified, very, very simplified account of this process. So the input stimulus, let's say, contains features A, B, and C. And this is pattern separated to C because we've already got various representations that include these features A and B. And this reduces interference with existing stored representations that have, say, ABD, ABE, and so on. So we've pattern separated the incoming stimulus to C. Now, at retrieval, C is pattern completed to ABC again. Now, in one sense, the memory consists of the full representation A, B, and C, but the stored neural representation is only C, right? And that missing part is supplied, as I said, from some other neural representation, or it could be supplied, at least some people hypothesize, on the basis of the perceptual experience or the cue. Okay, so that would be, I think, that would sort of complicate the idea that we should seek the full memory in some self-contained neural representation that's fairly localized. A third kind of set of considerations comes from recent work on reconsolidation. And this is the idea that memories are unstable at the time of retrieval and can be altered. So, to cut a long story short, and of course this relies on a great deal of research, some of which, some of you may know Elizabeth Loftus's research from the 70s and 80s, but then there's been some more recent research that tackles this more at the cellular and molecular level. But the basic idea is that these memories are labile, and especially during retrieval, there's a kind of interaction between a trace and some cue. And in some cases, this leads to misremembering, it leads to false memories. In other cases, it doesn't really. It leads to fairly accurate representations. It's just that these, the cue and the retrieval process somehow alters the memory. And when it's stored again, that is very often preserved. So the memory is actually altered when it's put back into long-term storage. And there's a recent paper by Sarah Robbins on this that explains some of the more recent work. And as she puts it there, this distinction between remembering and misremembering may not be neurally tractable precisely because of the role of the cue and the retrieval process in re-encoding and reconsolidating the memory. Now some constructivists would go even further and say, well, there isn't really any such thing as the stored representation. The whole search for a memory trace or an engram is itself misguided because these things are sort of recreated every single time. there's quite a bit of work, and I think Philippe de Brigard is here. Anyway, but his work is on, or I think goes a step further and says that constructivism ought to be understood in a very radical sense, in the sense that these things are really created on the fly every single time. And so the search for a trace or an engram is itself futile because of the way memory functions. And yet, I think a lot of psychologists may still want to be committed to the construct of memory and to making a distinction between false memories or accurate memories and false memories, even though the neural story is much more complicated and there are no self-contained representations. I don't know if this really illustrates it well, but the idea was that these cues are themselves functioning as part of the memory, even though they're not really stored as memories. So to try and sum up, what I've tried to argue is that episodic memory is sometimes individuated contextually or extrinsically, and that context is both based on, it could be based on the causal history of the organism, it could be based on the broader environmental context that the organism is located in. Whether something is an episodic memory and what it's a memory of depend on the broader environment and depend on the causal history or the etiology of the individual. The environmental retrieval cues may structure and even partly constitute the memory, and therefore this kind of environmental and etiological contextualism is likely to yield taxonomies that cross-cut the neural ones. And what I'm assuming here is very often, not always, but often and in many important instances, the psychological individuation, psychological unit of analysis is often the organism plus the environment, whereas neuroscientists, not always, but primarily, I think, are interested in self-contained mechanisms, especially cellular and molecular neuroscientists, but perhaps not every single time, but very often. And I also want to suggest that this kind of cross-cutting exists also among other scientific disciplines or subdisciplines, because structures and functions are very often individuated differently and in a cross-cutting fashion, as in the case of the gross phenotypic features that I mentioned earlier, and perhaps also in the case of structure and function when it comes to the brain and the broader functions that the neural mechanisms are being recruited to perform in a particular context or against the backdrop of a particular causal history. And that's it.
Is there any reason that one has to be one of these four things? Like, could I be localist about equine and constructivist about lateral prefrontal cortex and so on?
Sure. No, I think that's absolutely right. And I think that these taxonomic positions can be mixed and matched. So they're not mutually exclusive by any means. And they may not even be jointly exhaustive, though I think most of the positions that I can think of fit in one of those boxes or the other. But certainly I think it's quite possible to think that, yeah, well, episodic memory might be contextualist, but that's not to say that, other kinds of psychological functions are.
I have a question about how much you're willing to allow that the function F and function F star of the overlapping oral functions in the contextualist case. How much are you willing to say that they are different or the same? Like, first you said you don't want to be exactly the same main component that it should, because then it will be just localism again. But it also seems weird to me that we're willing to allow that these two functions, when the context shifts, are going to be radically different. And again, this might vary depending on the brain area. Some areas might be more plastic than others. But do you have any principled way in which we will be willing to talk about like shared or functional homologous functions with these overlapping areas?
The question of individuating functions is always a bit tricky, right? So you could sort of individuate them coarse-grained or fine-grained. You might say in the case of flying, well, bat doesn't really fly exactly the way that a bird does, and a bird doesn't fly exactly the way that an insect does, and so on. And so by melding them together, by kind of taxonomizing them in the same broad category, we're missing out on really important distinctions, right? And I guess what matters is whether we're gaining any explanatory power by putting them together. So if it turns out that there are certain commonalities in the kinds of selection pressures that led to the evolution of wings in birds and insects, then perhaps we have an explanatory advantage from grouping those two functions or calling them more or less the same function for those purposes. And so I guess it's all, in the end, in the service of explanatory power, inductive inference, whether we can make certain kinds of projections, and so on. And so if you can show that that kind of coarse-grained functional individuation buys you some kind of explanatory power, then it seems to me that you've got some grounds for undertaking that kind of taxonomy, right?
Sorry, is that me?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, sorry. Yeah, thanks very much. I had a similar set of worries about remembering versus misremembering as kind of different functions. But I also want to ask, so I mean, just at the very end here, I mean, you sort of seem to be setting up a contrast between these environmentally indexed functional properties and mechanistic approach. So I read it a little differently. I mean, it strikes me that intrinsicality is wrong, right? And that's the problem with the traditional localizationist view. But you're still telling causal interactions between external parts of the environment and specific information processing capacities that are underlying specific functions. That all sounds perfectly mechanistic to me in general. So how strongly do you want to draw that contrast, or is that really a conflict for you?
I mean, I don't think it's obligatory to individuate mechanisms narrowly rather than broadly. I do think that focusing on mechanism tends to, I mean, you know how Macomber, Darden, and Craver define it. Entities and activities organized in a certain manner to produce a certain result or something like that. The emphasis more is on commonality of structure and the interaction between the parts, rather than the broader function that it performs against a certain kind of backdrop or in a certain kind of context, right? And it's just a matter of emphasis. I mean, and it's a matter of which causal processes are we trying to track. Are we tracking the internal dynamics of the system, the way the system interacts, the different parts of the system interact with each other, or are we tracking the way that whole thing fits into a broader context, right? And I think the emphasis on the sort of trend to focus on mechanism emphasizes the former at the expense of the latter. But is it possible to individuate mechanisms functionally? Yeah, I guess you can. But I think the trend in the sort of mechanist literature in the philosophy of science has been more to focus on, pushings and pullings, as it were, as opposed to, okay, what purpose is this serving? It's not that you can't do one without the other. It's just that I think you'll find different subdisciplines or research programs are going to emphasize one rather than the other. But if they do, I don't think we have any reason to expect that they're going to come up with the same taxonomy.
Mike?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on sort of maybe a different aspect of this, what we should expect in terms of the differences in function in the contextualist case, or what kind of things we might be able to expect. First of all, I agree with Russ that we probably are going to tell different stories about different parts of the brain, and we're going to tell different stories about the same parts of the brain at different times. So that all seems correct to me. I think it's an open question how radically different the functions can be in different circumstances, because we don't yet know enough about the role that things like constraint play, mutual constraint play in determining neural function. Right. So here's a possibility where you could get probably pretty radical differences. So imagine you have two regions of the brain with a set of complex underlying causal properties, right? And they interact in a way that it imposes mutual constraint. And that sort of, as it were, selects out some subset of those causal properties. And that's how you end up with a function. And if you then interact with a different set of things, that it ends up selecting out a different subset, a partially non-overlapping subset of causal properties. And I think in that case, pointing to the region, even if whether you can analyze the function or not, you might not be able to. But I think in that case, you might get very, very different attributions of function to the shared reason.
Do you want to respond?
I'm not sure of the question, but
It's just a comment about another way of fleshing out the possibilities, which
right.
Yeah, that your point was to.
Yeah, so this was a finger on the previous question, but it seems to me that a lot of the mechanism literature is a little bit more focused on neuroscience in general, cellular, molecular, not so much systems and cognitive. And it seems like the cognitive scientists or cognitive neuroscientists really are individuating mechanisms in terms of function. And the only way that you pick out, a neuron and B4 as relevant to your study is because it has a certain relationship to the stimuli that you're presenting it. So, so to the extent that those are the folks who are really trying to reconcile the psychological and the neural levels, I think there's less of a conflict than you might think.
Yeah, that might be right. I mean, it is true that I was thinking more in terms of the sort of cellular molecular literature, which is what the philosophy of neuroscience is focused more on. But I mean, even there, it's open to individuate things a bit more in terms of their extrinsic causes. But I also think that there are instances in the systems neuroscience too, where researchers are focused more on how things operate within the brain, irrespective of. I mean, the thing I mentioned about the critical period, right? I mean, yeah, maybe that's more at the cellular level, because the mechanisms they're studying are pretty small. But
Even deciding whether something is an instance of plasticity or not requires some kind of relation to some
Right.
cue. So,
yeah,
at least,
right.
sure, you can just look and see if you have information of a new synapse or something, but that's
Right.
typically not.
Well, but they sometimes say, oh, look, well, in the stuff I looked at with the critical period, I think plasticity is operationalized in terms of, well, the dendrites can't move around anymore. There are these, I think, these protein sugar hybrid molecules that congeal around the dendrites, and that just prevents them from moving around. And that's the way the mechanism is identified in terms of its local properties. And then they say, oh, well, look, it turns out that this is why once this kicks in, if you uncover the eye of the cat that we've had covered, it can't regain binocular vision, right? And the motivation might be to study the broader question of how is there, how come there's a critical period. But they're identifying the decline in neural plasticity primarily at the kind of cellular level. Right? I'm not sure if that answers. I mean, I
think that there's a whole spectrum of
Right.
things that people
Sure.
do.
Yes.
But it's partially in virtue of the fact that lots of levels of that spectrum interact with the next level up, that that it's maybe not as big of a
Right.
obstacle as it is.
Mhm.
I think that you were trying to make it seem.
Okay.
So Chris, did you have a question? Not anymore?
No, it's okay.
Okay, perfect.
This conversation slide made me think that we kind of need a better taxonomy of function. That the different sorts of things we call functions are really quite different things. Like some are like, they might sort of come from folk psychology, and others, other things that I think of as psychological constructs are really kind of redescriptions of brain networks, like people talk about executive function or multiple demands networks, or these sorts of things. And that's really a description of something that some particular brain network does, and not really very satisfying. We don't really know what it is yet, but the best we've got. And then there are other things that, like, as I don't know whether the receptive properties of a particular, a particular neuron in V1 responding to a particular point to a receptive field. Is that really a psychological construct, or is it a redescription of what we know neurons do? Or it seems like maybe I don't have the better tools for breaking up the function side of this story.
Mhm.
And your examples of contextualization,
Mhm.
you can always expand the description of what you call a function to be. Here it could be a fall-in that's used for flying, and that would be different from a fall-in in general. And sort of the degree to which there's so much flexibility at that function side. What are we going to do about that?
I don't have a neat answer to that question, except in terms of what I said before about does that buy you any explanations, right? If you're individuating functions more finely, does it, forelimb that's used for flying or that's exacted for flying or something like that, right? Are there certain kinds of commonalities in those structures that explain certain things about why they evolved that way? So suppose you have convergent evolution or something like that, where different forelimbs are independently of each other come to be exacted for flying, right? Does it turn out that there are interesting commonalities in all those kinds of situations? Does it turn out that you can explain what sorts of conditions, what sort of environmental conditions are going to be particularly suited for, or particularly apt to lead to that kind of evolutionary development, right?
What you want to do with it, you want to map
Right.
onto it.
Yeah.
Anatomy, that's one set of descriptions. And you
Right.
want to, be the veterinary surgeon that fixes forelimbs for flying or something. You might need a different set of descriptions.
Right.
Hi, sorry, this is not going to be very helpful because I don't remember the name of the book, but I was reading a book on the flight over, and I just had a terrible memory that this is kind of speaking up. But in terms of functional taxonomy, there's work on this, and the one proposal is mechanistic function distinctions, and then within the mechanistic functional distinctions, you might be able to get some traction out of talking about computational methods.
Okay, Bill, this will be the last
This
question.
is perhaps naive, but the prismatic damage and a quadriplegic, it's been all over TV and stuff, how they've been figuring out what ways to have other parts take over. It's not memory, but how he's actually able to start getting a control. And it looks as though some of it is different parts of the brain or different connections taking over a role that was done by something else that's gone. And that surely gives a certain kind of flexibility that we might not have even thought possible before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I don't know about that case, but sure. I mean, there's lots of instances of neural plasticity. I guess what I'm trying to draw attention to is a somewhat different phenomenon, where you have in the same individual the very same regions, depending on different contexts, could be performing quite different functions.
Yeah, so I was just this case of the bat wing and the human arm, for instance. If you look at the arrangement of bones in both structures, I actually have that on my poster. It's exactly the same bones, the same set of bones, right? And obviously, they serve different purposes, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in different contexts.
Right.
But if you actually focus on, let's say you ask an engineer to
Mm-hmm.
give you an actual description of how the structure of bones in both humans and bats actually work. So you ask about degrees of freedom, how does it move and stuff. It's very, very similar. It's not exactly the same, but it's very, very similar. So here you have, right, different contexts, different function, but really by function you mean purpose. But if you look at the local level, the actual operation of how it actually works, it's exactly the same. And just to use the other example you used, called applying, I used the piston and the, but suppose you have a pair of pliers, right? So let's say a Letterman tool, right? So you can use it to work on your car. You can use it to extract a tube, or you can use it to torture someone. These are three different kinds of uses, right? But if you look at the actual operation of the plier, right? The analogy here would be, perhaps this is true of some brain regions. They do something, and that's not going to change. Now, Mike gave an example where it could change, but it's possible that for some regions, it doesn't change. The fundamental operation doesn't change. And you can come to a description that would be actually very useful to explaining its contribution in all of these different purposes, right? The description of the pliers would explain its contribution in, for a mechanic when you work on a car, or same thing with extracting a tooth and whatnot. The same thing can be true in functional anatomy, the case of the arrangement of the bones.
So you're saying you can define the function narrowly enough where it actually has the same function. So this is actually a functional.
Absolutely. I mean, there are lots
Well,
of
that's,
cases.
no, I wouldn't deny that. I mean, and this came up in other questions, right? There are narrower and broader ways of defining function. And the question is, does it ever pay off to define function broadly? And does that enable you to explain certain things that you otherwise wouldn't if you define function very narrowly? And yeah, this could be seen as both a structural and a functional kind of grouping. But it's not functional in the same sense as this grouping is. This is much more broadly functional.
Of course
right?
not, but then when contextualism, you said, if that's the case, the kind of examples I was proposing, if that's the case, then contextualism just goes back to localism, right? Well, fine. Then you would be able to localize, or to actually narrow down on one certain description of what the structure does, and it pretty much always does the same kind of thing when you describe it in a certain way that's useful useful for explaining different, it's involved in different kinds of purposes.
I'm not sure that's right. I mean, this is where the analogy is beginning to break down a bit, because, you know, right here we have presumably the same brain region or network somehow subserving different functions, right? Here we don't have quite that same idea, and so I don't think it enables us to restore localism, right?
I don't see why we don't have that same idea in the case of the human arm. And let's focus on the arrangement of bones because that's the homology.
Mm-hmm.
I think we have exactly the same structure, working in exactly the same way, right? The degrees of freedom are very similar, but then it contributes to things.
I mean, you can't say exactly the same way.
Well,
right?
you know, of course, in the bat, the fingers are much longer, right? They reach out.
Right.
But and of course, right? You know, the bat is limited. You know, can't sort of grasp it into the wing, right?
Right.
But if you look at, you know, just ask an engineer. That's a very simple case. The brain is probably a lot more complex than just this kind of movement. But
Sure.
to me, it sounds like if you were to sort of forget about the wing, just look at how this thing moves, right? It'd be very, very similar.
I'm not sure what you're saying. Are you saying so this is really the only legitimate taxonomy, which is both structural and functional?
No, I would mean, like, this is one way of describing what a structure does, and one way of explaining why its contribution to different functions, might be the same. Well, we can talk about it later.
Can I just, because I'm just wondering about the sort of parallels between what you're saying and what I was, the strong version of what I was arguing in my talk, because if you think about a structure like perirhinal cortex, you know, is it important for memory? Is it important for other stuff? Or, you know, the strong version of what was arguing is that it's important for representing these high-level complex representations. And then if you look at the function or the context of that, those are important in the case of these kind of weird visual discrimination tasks, artificial ones that I made up. They're also super useful for declarative memory. And so on the surface, that's why it looks like this structure is critical. Well, it is critical for declarative memory, and why people might assume it's critical for declarative memory only. It's because these representations happen to be really important for that task. You know, representations of edges and stuff aren't so important for declarative memory. So it really depends on how you're defining the function and you know, the way you're thinking about it. So it's sort of again, a levels of description type thing. But you know, the strong version of what I was arguing seems to be very similar to what you're saying. Actually, it just depends on how you look at these things, and maybe, you know, again, we're sort of trapped by our folk psychological notions of some of these things, and if we make too many assumptions based on those, then we might. So what I was arguing was actually kind of a strong version of sort of a localist view as well. It's just that we've got the wrong
Right.
sort of description.
Yeah, so you could maybe isolate a lower level function that would correspond to the role of the perirhinal cortex.
Yeah, and
right?
explain why it's important
Right.
for all of these sort of higher
Right.
level functions.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right, we're out of time. We're going to have a 15-minute break and be back here. But first, let's thank Khalidi.